Ethan Vale, you're done here.
The warning tone cut through the room like a blade. For a second, I thought it was another system alert until I saw my name flash red across the upper screen. Employee access revoked. It was 8:42 a.m. when Daniel Rhodes, the CEO's son, barely 30 and already talking like he owned the ocean, said my name. Ethan Vale. You're done here. The words hit harder than I expected. The hum of the servers stopped feeling mechanical and started feeling personal, as if the system itself was holding its breath. If you've ever faced a moment that changed everything in silence, tell me, where are you listening from right now? Don't forget to subscribe. The story's just beginning. I turned toward him. Still processing. For what exactly? Unauthorized access, he said, crisp and proud. You breached restricted route data, effective immediately. Around us, no one spoke. Monitors reflected blue light on frozen faces. Keyboards hung mid-air above half-typed commands. Through the wide glass, cranes crawled across the docks, moving slower than the silence between us. 17 years. I had built this room, the Blue Grid network, the algorithm that routed thousands of vessels safely through storm corridors. Every system heartbeat was mine. And now, a boy who still smelled of boardroom perfume was cutting that line. I'd like to see the logs, I said. My tone calm, too. Calm. Daniel smiled the way people smile before closing a door. You'll receive a formal report. Security will escort you. He expected a scene. Instead, I unclipped my badge, feeling the cold metal press against my palm. Don't bother, I said quietly, and placed it on the console. The main screen flickered again. Just beneath the static, a message blinked, ghost route detected. No one else noticed. I did. I always noticed. I turned and walked out. The glass doors slid open with a sigh, the kind you hear at the end of something you didn't plan to lose. Outside, sunlight burned off the fog above the harbor. I stopped at the access gate habit, maybe defiance, and pressed my badge to the scanner one last time. A soft click. The light turned green. The system still knew my name. Whatever erased me from their payroll hadn't reached the code yet. The wind off the water was sharp enough to sting. I didn't bother buttoning my coat. I wanted the cold to keep me awake. Each step along the coastal road sounded hollow against the concrete, like the sound of an empty hallway after the meeting ends. Gulls traced circles over the gray horizon, screaming the way people do when they still think someone is listening. I didn't. I walked without a destination, just away. Away from Dock 7, away from the echo of Daniel Rhodes's voice. Away from 17 years that had just been folded into a single line of termination code. The ocean beside me rolled slow and indifferent, its surface shifting between steel and silver. I'd spent most of my life trying to make the unpredictable predictable, mapping chaos into neat coordinates. Now it all felt like a joke I hadn't gotten until the punchline hit me in the chest. The air smelled of salt and fuel. Every few minutes, a freighter's horn groaned somewhere beyond the fog. I had designed those paths, the invisible lanes beneath their hulls. The Blue Grid system had been my life's work, a lattice of logic that turned millions of moving tons into order. 17 years of midnight calibrations, failed algorithms, and coffee that tasted like wire. 17 years of watching data breathe like tides. And for what? So a boardroom heir with perfect hair could accuse me of breaching my own system. I wasn't angry yet, just hollow, the kind of hollow that doesn't echo. The road curved inland toward my building, a narrow apartment perched over the shore. The light had turned amber by the time I reached it. Inside, the air smelled faintly of salt and old paper. The only sounds were the slow ticking of the wall clock and the distant pulse of waves hitting the pier. I didn't turn on the lights. The dusk was enough. I sat down, untied my shoes, and froze. On the soles, thin white crusts of salt had formed, like veins across leather. I brushed them gently with my thumb. The crystals cracked under the pressure, small, brittle sounds that filled the room. I realized I'd walked miles without noticing, as if some part of me had wanted to keep moving until everything fell off job. Pride, purpose, The clock ticked again, loud this time. I stood, went to my desk, and powered up the terminal I'd built years ago. From spare parts a personal mirror to the company's network. It shouldn't have connected. Yet the interface bloomed to life, lines of blue code cascading across the screen. The blue grid system still pulsed, alive and synchronized, reflecting real-time routes from the global server. I leaned forward, half curious, half numb. Cargo routes blinked across the map: Singapore, Rotterdam, São Paulo, the usual arteries of trade. Then, near the North Atlantic sector, a single vessel tag shimmered to life. Aurora 5. The name hit me like a whisper from a ghost. The Aurora 5 had been decommissioned months ago, stripped for scrap after a mechanical fire in port. I'd signed its final report myself. Yet here it was, moving at 12 knots on an active line, transmitting a clean signal as if nothing had ever happened. I stared at the coordinates, the pulse of its beacon sliding across the grid I had once trusted completely. For a moment, I thought the system was glitching, a data echo looping from old archives. But the timestamp was current, the feed live. My throat tightened, the air felt colder. 17 years building perfection, and the first flaw I'd ever seen was staring right back at me, breathing, sailing, and very much alive. The glow of the monitor cut through the dark like a thin blade. I hadn't turned on any lights. I wanted the room to feel the same way I did, half alive, half watching. My fingers moved on instinct, tracing commands I'd written years ago. The terminal hummed as the satellite archives unfolded layer by layer, showing the quiet pulse of the world's oceans. I searched for the Aurora Phi again. The feed was live, the coordinates shifting across the North Atlantic. I opened the satellite logs. 30 days, unbroken. Every entry looked legitimate until I noticed the cargo manifest: 20 containers of medical equipment. The same shipment, repeated 3 times in 2 weeks, routed through different insurance codes. Impossible. The system flagged nothing because it couldn't. The fraud was written in its own language. I filtered the financial traffic, tracing the digital wake of the ship. Payments had been processed to offshore accounts disguised as port maintenance fees, each one funneled through a holding firm based in Cyprus. My breath slowed as I compared the approval signatures against archived insurance claims. The authorization name was the same across them all: Daniel Rhodes, the son of the CEO, the man who had fired me 48 hours before my bonus. The realization came quietly. Not as anger, but as clarity. Every stolen dollar had traveled under the shield of my own creation, the Blue Grid encryption. The architecture I'd built to protect the company's trade secrets. My system, my code, my integrity repurposed to hide a crime. I whispered it before I meant to. They used my code. The words tasted like metal. For years, I had told every new engineer that technology was only as moral as the person controlling it. Now the proof of its corruption filled my screen in neat, efficient lines. Each coordinate, each timestamp, each confirmation ping was a betrayal I had unwittingly designed. I leaned closer, scanning the binary trail for anomalies. That's when I found it: a secondary relay address hidden beneath the main server calls. It mirrored every packet of data leaving the Blue Grid system, copying them in real time to an external host. I decrypted the string. The server domain belonged to a private financial division registered under Rhodes International Holdings, Daniel's own shell company. A cold shiver crawled through me. It wasn't just fraud, it was a complete parallel network, a reflection of everything we did, built to move money in shadows under the guise of global shipping. I sat back, staring at the web of connections blooming across the monitor. The entire thing pulsed softly, almost like it was breathing. 17 years building a system to make the ocean honest, and it had been turned into a thief. That night, there was no anger, no panic, only a strange, lucid stillness. The truth wasn't heavy, it was clean, and once seen, it couldn't be unseen. 2 weeks earlier, Daniel Rhodes had walked into my office with that rehearsed confidence he mistook for leadership. He'd leaned on my desk, hands in his pockets, and said he needed temporary access to the Blue Grid API to test a new insurance module. It sounded harmless at the time, routine even. We ran dozens of integrations a year. I gave him a limited clearance window, logged every transaction, and reminded him that the system recorded every keystroke. He smiled like he'd already won something. Now, watching the data unravel on my screen. I understood what he'd really asked for. The test had been a trigger, a command string buried inside the API request. It opened a hidden pathway in the routing protocol, allowing shipments to be duplicated in the record while the real funds were diverted elsewhere. The ghost routes hadn't appeared out of nowhere. They had been manufactured through my own system. My jaw clenched as I scrolled through the internal email logs. Every message between Daniel and the finance division had been disguised as standard operational traffic. I decrypted the attachments and found a chain of authorizations labeled charter fee adjustments. Each contained transfers routed to offshore accounts, hidden behind layers of corporate shells. There was nothing accidental about it. Every line was deliberate, calculated, and protected under the same encryption I had written to keep thieves out. For a moment, anger burned through me like static. I wanted to storm into headquarters, drag Daniel into the light, make him look at the wreckage he'd built. But I knew how that would end. Anger was noise, and noise got silenced. I forced my breathing steady and kept reading. The deeper I dug, the clearer the picture became. All signatures tied back to Daniel's sub-account, not his father's. The real CEO, Gregory Rhodes, hadn't approved any of it. In fact, his access log showed no interaction with Blue Grid for months. Daniel had isolated him completely, running the company's lifeblood through a private channel he alone controlled. The betrayal landed harder than the firing ever had. I'd worked side by side with Gregory for years, trusted his vision, helped him modernize a fleet older than both of us combined. And now his son was gutting that legacy from the inside, hiding the evidence under my name. The rage in me cooled, condensed into something sharper. If I lost control, this would die with me. But if I stayed quiet, if I played the long game, I could expose it all. If not me, I whispered, then no one will stop this. The cafe was nearly empty at noon, just the sound of the sea scraping against the rocks below the deck. I sat near the window, the same seat I'd used for years whenever I needed to think. The air smelled of espresso and salt. My laptop sat open in front of me, the Blue Grid interface glowing faintly against the sunlight. 48 hours left before my $92,000 bonus was due money that didn't matter anymore except for what it symbolized proof that I hadn't been erased yet. I planned each move the way a captain charts a course through fog, slow, deliberate, certain. I'd gathered the core data logs, traced the fraudulent transactions, and stripped the files of personal identifiers. Everything I needed to expose Daniel Rhodes sat in one encrypted folder. I titled it simply, "To the Real Owner." On the table beside the laptop was a small photograph. The edges were worn. The colors faded the face of an old sea captain, gray-bearded and smiling against a storm. He'd been my mentor when I first joined the company. The man who taught me that precision was a kind of honesty. Ships only stay afloat because someone checks the bolts no one else notices, he used to say. I ran a thumb over the photo and felt that truth anchor me again. I took a breath, steadied my hands, and initiated a small test transmission, a harmless probe to see if the route to the audit network was still open. The progress bar crept forward, 30%, 50%. Then it froze. The cursor blinked. A red notification appeared. Access denied, firewall restriction. My chest tightened. I tried again. Changing credentials, switching routes, nothing. Every path I built collapsed into the same wall. They had locked the system from the inside. My heart pounded louder than the waves outside. I had planned for everything except this. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the failed upload icon. The temptation to delete everything washed over me like the tide pulling back from shore. Maybe it was over. Maybe Daniel had already sealed every door I could reach. Then, a heavy wave struck the outer railing, rattling the windows. The sound jolted me a deep, familiar crash. And in that echo, a memory surfaced years ago. I'd established a mirror backup server housed in a Nordic data center, built during a system expansion Gregory himself had approved. Independent, untouchable. My pulse steadied. The plan wasn't dead, it had just changed its coordinates. Outside, the wind carried the scent of salt and iron, and for the first time in days, I allowed myself to breathe. Hope had returned, Riding on the sound of the sea, the docks were empty at midnight, wrapped in a cold, salt-heavy mist that blurred the line between sea and sky. The moon hung low, its reflection trembling on the black surface of the water like a signal waiting to be answered. I stood there alone, phone in my hand, thumb hovering over a single name on the screen, Captain A. I had stared at that contact for 10 minutes, maybe more. The old man hadn't called me in years, not since the day he retired to the northern coast. Back then, I'd promised to visit, to thank him properly for everything he'd taught me. I never did. And now, after all this time, the only thing connecting us was a number I wasn't sure still worked. My breath clouded in the cold air. The world felt stripped to its elements: water, wind, steel, memory, somewhere far down the pier. A buoy bell rang softly, echoing through the fog. I hit record and lifted the phone. My voice came out rougher than I expected. "Testing connection," I said, pausing, then added quietly, "Signal stable." The words hung there, meaningless and too personal at once. I replayed them, listening to the sound of my own hesitation for a second. I almost laughed at how empty it all felt, a man talking to no one, recording proof of his loneliness. I saved the message to drafts, thumb hovering over delete. What was I expecting? That he'd remember me, that an old man could somehow fix what a corporation had broken? The idea was absurd, almost childish. I stared at the screen until it dimmed, then turned off the phone altogether. The silence that followed was heavier than before. I leaned on the railing, the metal cold under my palms. The sea moved slow and dark beneath me. For a while, I just watched the moonlight break apart on the waves, trying not to think about the files still waiting on my desk, or the 48 hours ticking away faster than I could plan. At some point, exhaustion won. I must have dozed standing up, because the next thing I remember was the faint vibration in my hand. The phone lit up, its glow cutting through the fog. An unknown number, a voice, deep and familiar, spoke before I could breathe. Is this the man who once guided me through the storm? My throat closed. I didn't answer. I just closed my eyes, letting the wind sting them dry. The tears never came, but my vision trembled all the same. The hour before dawn has its own kind of silence, the kind that listens back. My apartment was lit only by the faint blue glow of the monitor, its reflection cutting across the coffee mug beside me and the faint tremor of my hands. The air felt electric, charged with a stillness that came right before the break of something irreversible. I'd been awake for 20 hours straight, piecing every document, every trace, every encrypted log into one coherent package. Every byte mattered, every second counted. Outside, the sea was just a dark line beyond the window, but the rhythmic crash of the waves kept time for me better than any clock. I opened the final terminal window. The secure relay link blinked, waiting for input. The Nordic backup node, the one I'd built years ago, was still alive, still loyal. It was my last remaining route, and I knew once I pressed send, there would be no undoing it. I compressed the files, layering the encryption manually, the way I used to before automation existed. Each pass of the algorithm carried my signature, a string of letters and numbers I hadn't used since Gregory Rhodes himself had approved it. My identity, buried in code. It felt like sealing a letter with a wax stamp, a quiet declaration that I was still here. When everything was ready, I paused. The cursor blinked against the blue field, impatient, almost human. My heart was steady. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't angry or scared or lost, just focused, controlled. I pressed send, the transfer initiated, the screen pulsing once, then again. Lines of coordinates began to update in real time. I switched to the global route map, and what happened next didn't seem real. One by one, the ghost routes flickered out. Cargo paths vanished from the Atlantic grid like stars being snuffed out in sequence. The network, the one Daniel had built through deceit, was collapsing live, unraveling itself like a tide pulling back from shore. I watched until the last falsified ship icon blinked out, leaving only clean, legitimate data streams. The map was quiet again. My chest felt lighter, for the first time since this began. I could breathe without hearing static in my own head. Then, a notification appeared in the corner of the screen. No subject, no sender, just a single line of text, "Stay where you are." I stared at it. The monitor's glow soft against the dawn light creeping through the blinds. Something had shifted the current, the silence, the story itself. By morning, the world knew. The television in the corner flickered with breaking headlines, logos spinning, anchors speaking faster than their breath could keep up. I didn't need the volume to understand. The scrolling ticker told the whole story. International Maritime Fraud Investigation expands roads shipping under federal review. Every channel showed the same feed footage from the company's headquarters. Reporters crowded the glass entrance I used to walk through every day, their voices rising over each other as executives hurried past in dark suits. Flashbulbs popped like gunfire. Daniel's name filled every caption, followed by the words, "financial misconduct and insurance manipulation." I watched in silence, one hand resting on the windowsill. The air smelled faintly of salt and coffee. Outside, the horizon had brightened into a dull silver, and the tide was moving out. The sea didn't care who was falling apart on land. It had seen bigger empires sink. As the camera panned across the press conference table, I caught a glimpse of the company's crest behind a wall of microphones. The sound cut in just long enough to hear a reporter shout, "Was the CEO aware of his son's actions?" Then came the stammering denial, the rehearsed confusion, the look of disbelief that always follows discovery too late. Another headline rolled across the screen. Insurance firms suspend contracts pending investigation. The company's stock graph dipped like a cliff edge, all those years of arrogance and borrowed certainty, collapsing in seconds under the weight of truth. I should have felt triumphant. I didn't. What I felt was quieter, deeper, like the moment after thunder when the world exhales again. Then the twist arrived. Uninvited, but inevitable. One of the networks cut to a correspondent outside headquarters. Behind her, the screen flashed with an image, my image. Sources confirmed the data that triggered the investigation was provided by former logistics director Ethan Vale, terminated 48 hours before his scheduled bonus. There it was. No dramatics, no speculation, just fact, my name, attached to justice. I turned off the television. The apartment fell into a calm hum, broken only by the faint cry of a gull outside. I walked to the window, resting my palm against the cold glass. The sea stretched out in its usual indifference, endless and unbothered, somewhere far beyond the horizon. The storm had finally passed. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. The ocean was calm again, as if it had never known a storm at all. The sun was lowering itself into the horizon when I found myself back at the pier. The same stretch of dock where I'd stood in silence just nights ago now felt different, lighter somehow, though the air still carried the same salt and steel. The sea was calm again, the kind of calm that only follows wreckage. The phone buzzed in my pocket. For a moment, I thought it was another news alert about the investigation, another headline tearing through what remained of Rhodes shipping. But when I saw the name on the screen, Captain A, I froze. I answered before doubt could catch up to me. The line crackled, a soft hum of distance between continents. Then came that voice, steady, deep, weathered by years and oceans. "They used your system to hide lies," he said. "But you use the same system to reveal truth. That's the difference between a machine and a man." I didn't reply. My throat tightened. The sound of waves filled the silence between us, soft and rhythmic. He continued, his words carrying the calm authority of someone who had seen too many storms to fear another. "That's why I built this fleet. Ethan, not for profit, for people like you who still believe integrity belongs at the helm." The wind caught my breath before I could form a response. I stared at the horizon where the sun melted into copper light. Ships in the distance glimmered like scattered embers across the water. Then came the pause, the kind that feels like the world waiting for one last turn. "Tomorrow," the captain said, his tone softening. "You'll receive more than your bonus. You'll receive command." I closed my eyes. The words didn't feel like reward. They felt like closure. A bridge between everything I'd lost and everything I hadn't known I was still holding on to. The orange light spilled across the water, painting the pier gold. My reflection wavered against it. Older, steadier, freer. I never steered for money, I said quietly, not sure if I was talking to him or to the sea itself. On the other end, there was a faint chuckle, a sound like the creak of an old ship settling back into balance. That's exactly why you should steer, he said. The call ended. The sea breathed. And for the first time in years, I felt the tide moving with me, not against. Dawn arrived quietly, slipping into the room before I even noticed. The blinds caught the first light and scattered it across the floor, turning the corners of my office gold. The sea outside glimmered through the window, pale blue and alive again, after so many sleepless nights. I finally felt the stillness that comes when the fight is over. The inbox icon blinked once. I hesitated before opening it, unsure whether I was ready for whatever waited next. The subject line was short. Almost humble appointment director of global maritime integrity. I read it twice, not because I doubted it, but because the words carried more weight than any title I had ever held. It wasn't just a promotion, it was a reclamation, a clean slate carved from the wreckage. I leaned back in my chair, the old wood creaking softly beneath me. On the desk sat the same mug of coffee I'd poured 2 days earlier, cold now but still half full. I picked it up, tasted the bitterness, and let it settle on my tongue like a final reminder of what endurance actually costs. The morning light grew stronger, brushing against the frames of old photographs that lined the shelf, the original Blue Grid prototype, the early team, and one picture of the captain standing beside a younger version of me, both of us squinting into a brighter future. The phone buzzed. A message appeared on the screen. No name, no greeting, just words that carried the familiar weight of his voice. When you stand before the sea, remember ships need storms to find their course. I read it 3 times before the meaning sank in. The storms weren't punishment, they were proof of direction. Without them, no compass mattered. I stood, walked to the window, and unlatched it. The morning air swept in, crisp and salt-heavy, far out on the horizon. A cargo ship was moving steadily toward open water. Its wake shimmered behind it, white and honest against the calm. Not a ghost, not a signal, real steel. Real purpose. The light shifted, crossing the edge of the desk, touching the coffee mug, then my hands. At 7:45 a.m., sunlight moved across the water, and for the first time in years, I let it touch me. In the end, I realized the sea was never against me. It was only testing whether I still remembered how to steer. Every storm, every silence, every loss was a lesson in patience and direction. Sometimes you have to be broken open to see what you're really made of. Integrity doesn't come from never falling. It comes from rising quietly when no one expects you to. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments which moment spoke to you the most. Was it the silence before the fall, or the calm that followed after? And if you want more stories that remind you of strength, redemption, and the quiet power of standing your ground, subscribe and stay with us. When you do, you won't just follow a channel, you'll join a space where every story reflects a piece of your own. Like, share, and pass it forward to someone who might need a little light today, because sometimes that's how courage spreads, one story at a time.